As you know, my name is Mariam Al-shammari, and as he said, I am an educator, a researcher, and a lifelong learner. But what's the point of knowledge if you don't pass it on? So, I will be discussing, apparently, that was a little too soon, but I will be discussing economic development, how nations rise. Now, this is something that is very near and dear to my heart. Untapped potential. This concept that where you are and where you could be are a lot closer than you might think. But put your individual potential aside. What about the potential of a nation? How can we go from, let's say, a less than ideal state to a state that is constantly and consistently progressing? Now first, we take a few steps back and we realize that economic development is a very difficult thing to quantify. But the United Nations has developed a Human Development Index, and this is a good start. So I'm going to try to simplify this as best as I can. The HDI works with three concepts. The first is life expectancy. So how long are you expected to live in the region that you live in? Of course, this is going to relate to many things, but mostly how well off is your society? Now, how well off your society is connected to something we call a gross national income per capita. So to simplify that one as well, how much do you make on average based on the region you live in? Now, not surprisingly, both of these things relate directly to education, skill level, and how your society has educated and moved on and developed itself. So these are the three development indexes. I want you to remember them, and we'll go through them again. For context, here's a map of the world. You'll realize that regions that have been hit with conflict have a lower life expectancy than other places that would be considered a little more developed. Now, what I would like to discuss specifically is the difference between public and private education. Now, my preference is not hidden at all. There's this concept that we consistently debate, this idea that what is better, and it's debated all over the world, but notably here in Kuwait. Is it public or private education? Now, private education is seldom the answer. In fact, it is a tool that we use to divide ourselves. We have classism, we have privilege, we have so many layers that add into the school system when we divide ourselves. But when we keep ourselves, the entire society, whether you're, regardless of socioeconomic status, in the same schools, we're exposed to more, we experience more. But above all else, we see something very important that happens when we invest in public education. Societies that invest in public education are more so producers than consumers. What we see when people invest heavily in the private sector is something called crisis capitalism. Something that is a complicated kind of notion, but it boils down to the fact that any form of conflict or division is a good opportunity to make profit. So we're not investing in the people, we're not investing in the students, we're investing in the profit we make from them. Which is why I'm a huge advocate for public education and public research. But don't take my word for it, let's discuss an example. We have Rwanda, okay, which will show up for you soon. It's a small country in the African subcontinent. Rwanda was struck with a genocide in the early 90s. Now, conflict has a huge role in setting societies back. This cannot be ignored. And to relate it to our society, Kuwait also suffered in the early 90s. And that can't be ignored when we discuss our own local efforts. Now, Rwanda, after this genocide, now the genocide was in 94. For context, the early 90s was the rise of technology and development and globalization more so than any decade before. During this time, we see what we're experiencing in the private-public separation. In fact, in Rwanda before the war, or before the genocide, if I want to be a little more specific, education was available only to the elite. So if you were not rich, you weren't educated at all. Now, we're going to go back a few years, because if we look at 94, it's going to be a little bit too tough to give an image of a country in the middle of crisis. But in 1991, the literacy rates were at 57.9%. In 2019, it's 72.3%. Literacy just means the basic ability to read and write. That's a 14.4% jump. That might sound small in terms of numbers, but percentages can be tricky. For a population of almost 12 million, that translates to 2 million people now having basic life skills and access to education. Rwanda has a national public education for all policy that allows their residents and their citizens to gain education all the way to the university level for free, which was unheard of before. We continue to the next, if you remember, HDI indicator, life. In 1991, Rwandese people were only expected to live to about 30 years old. Many of us in this room are older than that. Today, it's above that, almost more than double, at 68.75 years. Finally, we look at GNI. Now, these numbers might be small to an oil-rich country, but what we need to remember is that Rwanda has no natural resources. They're an arid land. They have nothing to kind of benefit themselves. Their GNI jumped from 271 USD to 829 USD. Now, to contextualize that, that's a quadruple jump. Imagine Kuwait quadrupled our national income for every region, from Jahra down to Wafra. That might give you a bit of a perspective of how much of a jump this was. We move forward just to give you an idea of just how bad this conflict was. We went from digging up mass graves to hosting technological conferences representing the African continent. This is possible, but why is it possible? The reason this is possible is public education. Now, we're not going to ignore that there are many nuances. Rwanda still has conflict, political tensions. Some people even see their current president as a dictator. But we remove the nuances and we look at the numbers. We look at the concrete changes. And there is no denying that removing classism in education opens the door for possibilities for each one of us. Now, what's your role? Why am I talking about Rwanda to a group in the middle of Kuwait City? The fact is, here we have some of the greatest potential I have ever seen, untapped potential. Part of the reason our potential is untapped is because of this divisive system that we have currently going on. Now, alhamdulillah, Kuwait does have education for all in terms of public education, but access isn't the only issue. We want quality of education. So what is your role? What if you're not an educator? What if you're not a researcher? What can you do? First, I would like to say this. Complaining solves nothing. However, blind patriotism also doesn't solve a thing. So, when you want to criticize something because you love it, you come back with concrete suggestion or solutions. Today, I have suggestions for you. If you're a local, you're living here, the first and most obvious thing is support local businesses. Put your money into your community. If you're an investor, you're somebody who might have the wealth and want to build something new, invest in your community. Hire people equally committed to the community as you are. Build a vision and grow from your own roots. Now, if let's say you're probably not the wealthiest person around, but you have skills, start charging for them. Build a society of creators, not just consumers. Now, if you're a researcher or a student like myself, I encourage you and I implore you, take your research, go around the world, find best practices, bring your knowledge back to the same community. Allow us to grow together step by step. And if you're a policymaker, a leader in general across the world, do better. Listen to your local experts. Listen to the people, those who might still not have access to the benefits that you have. And this can really propel us forward. So today, all I want to say to you is, education doesn't just mean formal education. It's not just the classroom and the teacher and the whiteboard. No, education is whatever you want it to be. It could be watching TED videos. It could be researching something you never studied because now you're 50 and you're almost about to retire, but you really love this topic. But a mass push for self-development will propel the entire nation forward. And that is how nations rise. Now, with that being said, I would really love if every single person here could reflect on what you can do for your community and what have you done for your community. If you don't have an answer for that, maybe it's time to go back to the writing board and figure it out. Finally, I would like to thank every single one of you for attending TEDx 2019 here in Kuwait City. It has been a pleasure to be with you guys, and we hope you have a great evening. Thank you.